So one of the people who has aroused the ire of the social justice brigades recently is Steven Pinker, of all people. And, this is hilarious to me because Steven Pinker is pretty much a shitlib, although an unusually astute and honest one, as these things go. But he's a typical center leftist of less than a generation ago, and he's getting dogpiled and pilloried by these social justice warriors for some comments he made as part of a roundtable discussion or a panel discussion. And basically what he said is that alt-right people tend to be fairly intelligent people, and that we discover certain facts that have been suppressed. The discussion of these facts has been shamed and made taboo, and that when we discover these facts, we become very angry about having been lied to. And because we lack context or perspective, to put these facts into context, we take them to absurd and extreme and, in his view, repugnant conclusions. But he says, if we were simply honest about these facts and could discuss them openly, then we could provide that context and prevent people from becoming extremists or radicalizing or coming to extreme conclusions. And then he attempts to do that in a couple of ways, which, frankly, are all pretty laughable. So some of the stuff he said in that video, links below, he said that, the fact that men and women are not identical has no implication for whether we should discriminate against women. Because, he says, in every trait where men and women differ on average, there's a lot of overlap in those distributions, and so we can't make any reliable predictions about individuals based on these differences in averages. Now, that's a really dumb argument for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's not true that it has no implications because the distributions overlap, because sometimes you're not concerned with the areas where the distributions overlap. You're concerned with the areas where they don't overlap. So, for example, for elite military units, you are not looking for the areas where men and women's strength overlap. You're looking for men who are already on the extreme right-hand side of the distribution for masculine athleticism and aggression and some other traits, characteristics. So you're not looking for people from the areas where the distributions overlap. You're looking for people from the areas outside where the distributions overlap. And, there may be some outliers, some extreme outlier women who nevertheless fall into that area. But when you start talking about the cost of training people and washing them out and injuring them, it may just not be worthwhile. And the extreme paucity of candidates who are going to qualify if they're female, according to those standards, if you're not willing to dilute those standards, just to satiate their vanity, then, the benefits of even allowing it are vanishingly small, and the costs are huge, and so the benefits would be huge of simply just categorically denying them. So that's one case where an overlapping distribution can still imply a discriminatory policy as, rational in terms of cost-benefit. But, there are also distributions that don't overlap at all. And one of these is, with all, due deference to the gender insanity ideologues, women can bear children. Men cannot. There's no overlap there. It's a binary. So, and I've explained in the past how it therefore makes sense for men to specialize in certain kinds of things, risk-taking behavior, or let's say, economic production, careerism, things that might take them away from the home and distract from reproduction or child rearing, because it's biologically less costly for men. Men have more freedom to engage in that kind of stuff. And, because reproduction is biologically much more costly for women, it makes more sense for them to specialize in that. That's a division of sexual labor and gender roles based on a non-overlapping distribution, which Pinker seems to doubt can even exist. but that distribution doesn't overlap at all. So, that argument was really dumb. He also says that commitment to anti-racism, I don't remember exactly how he explained it, or opposition to racism, is not a factual claim about the absolute equality of individuals from all groups, or all groups, whatever. You get what I'm saying. He's saying it's not a factual claim. It's an ethical principle to treat people as individuals and according to their own individual merits. Now, this is a really dumb argument because that's a heuristic, all right? That's a heuristic, and it may not be a better heuristic than discriminating according to stereotypes, for certain reasons, which I've already outlined above in relation to women. There are no absolute universal values or principles that apply in all cases. There are no absolute goods. There are no absolute values. Rules have value for particular purposes, and that means, within certain limits where they serve those purposes and don't actually contravene their own stated purposes or actual purposes or whatever kind of purposes. So, not at all. It's not something where you can say a priori that one heuristic is better than the other. There may be cases where one heuristic is better. There may be cases where the other heuristic is better. Individualism may be a better heuristic for some cases. Stereotyping and discrimination may be a better heuristic for other cases. I don't think you can say a priori that one is better than the other in all cases. But the other thing is, he's not providing context here. Because when people talk about equality, they're not talking about it generally from a classical liberal perspective. They're not talking about equal rights or equal opportunities, which are problematic in their own right. These people are engaging in victim identity politics. Anybody who brings this up is probably engaging in victim identity politics. They are not arguing meritocracy. They are not arguing individualism. They are not arguing anything like that. They are slurring me as a white male, as their oppressor. They are blaming me for all of their problems. They are blaming my ancestors for their supposed historical grievances. And, they're asserting an entitlement to what's mine now. And they're doing so duplicitously and maliciously as part of these victim grievance narratives. So he's not supplying context here. He's trying to substitute this tiny little minority classical liberal viewpoint that nobody actually has except for him and a handful of other people, and claim that that's the context when it's not the real context. The real context is these SJWs who are malicious and parasitic. That's the real context. He also says generalizations can change over time. Now, that's not untrue and absolutely untrue. But then he cites the case of Irish. And, Irish used to have higher crime rates than other ethnicities, but now that they don't, apparently. So, the fact that certain other groups, certain other identifiable ethnicities, visually identifiable ethnicities, may have higher crime rates right now, today, doesn't mean that they will tomorrow. Doesn't necessarily mean that they will in a few years. All right, but this is nonsense because those differences in those cases persist over time, over centuries, and across continents, all over the world, everywhere, the same differences, approximately similar magnitudes, across socioeconomic strata. Those are much bigger differences, and they seem to be much more immutable. Now, I don't dispute in the very most general sense that if you take, if you consistently apply uniform standards across all groups, then that will tend to equalize those groups over time, over a long time, very slowly, but it will happen. It will tend to equalize those groups because that's a selective pressure. That's an evolutionary pressure. It will tend to equalize those groups over time. But in the meantime, if we are being impartial, if we are being just, then those groups that do have higher crime rates will also have higher arrest rates. And they'll also have higher conviction rates, and they'll also have higher incarceration rates. And that's something that neither they nor their enablers nor their defenders can tolerate, but will fight. And then if we go from impartiality, uniform standards, to, laxening standards for certain groups because they can't live up to the same standards at the same rates, well, then they're not going to improve. Giving them laxer standards, less enforcement, they may actually get worse. The gap may widen. So, that's a silly argument. Now, he also talks about Islam, and he says that the majority of terrorist attacks in America, Islamophobia is not justified because the majority of terrorist attacks in America are committed by right-wing extremists, domestic right-wing extremists. And this is silly. This is silly for a number of reasons. First of all, because, half of America is right-wing. And presumably he means white right-wing. So if something like 30% of America are white and right-wing, then, we're going to commit more of these arbitrarily defined attacks than, I would hope we would be committing more attacks than 1%. All right, because they'd have to be committing 30 times more attacks per capita for that not to be true. I would hope that that's not true. So that's kind of an invalid argument. And, furthermore, these analyses of attacks, it's always, they always do shady stuff. Like they're talking about number of attacks, not number of casualties. And even if they are talking about number of casualties, they always include an interval. They always involve an interval of time that doesn't include September 11th, 2001. All right, the single most casualty-producing attack. Just other shady stuff like this. The other thing is, if you're arguing for bringing more Muslims in, we're talking about, we're not necessarily worried about attacks in the past, we're worried about attacks in the future. So if you're talking about radically altering the number and proportion of Muslims in your country, that's something to be concerned about if they have a higher tendency per capita to engage in certain types of behavior. That's definitely something to be concerned about. And, Pinker's basically saying here, you're more likely to be a victim of X than Y, so why are you complaining about me trying to increase the likelihood of you being a victim of Y, right? Like X is still a bigger threat. Why are you mad about me trying to make Y a slightly bigger, but not even bigger than X threat? It's shitty logic. Terrible logic. And he also says that, this stereotype of Islam is not necessarily valid because Islam hasn't had the same kind of sectarian conflicts and schisms as Christianity, which I don't know where he's getting this from. He's just making it up. Of course they've had schisms. Of course they have sectarian conflict. Shia versus Sunni, duh. Come on, seriously. And he says there have been periods in time where Islam was more enlightened than Christianity. Which I just don't even know what to say to this stuff sometimes. We're talking about a religion that was spread by the sword for 1,400 years, for its entire history. And he wants to say there are periods in time where it wasn't quite as bad as Christianity. All right, whatever, Stephen. But, I've kind of been dumping on this guy, but he is more reasonable than most of his persuasion. I'll give him that. And he's done some good work in, countering some liberal leftist dogma, politically correct dogma.